All right, so we are going to go ahead and get started. So like I said, my name is Lauren. I work as an academic success coach, which is kind of an umbrella term for everything I do. But I work for the School of Nursing, and I'm the primary support person for graduate resources. Put a little bit of my contact information on the screen if you ever want to get in touch with me for any reason. A little bit about me and my background. I did a BS in communication and a BA from UT Austin. My background is actually in education. So I got my Master's of Education from Texas State University, which is how I came to the role that I have now. A little bit of more background information. I'm also from Dallas, Texas. Go Cowboys. And it's been an awesome time to kind of like move down 35 from, started in Dallas, went to school in Austin, and kept going. So that's a little bit about me. So a couple of housekeeping things. Webinar will last 55 minutes or less. Please feel free to ask questions in the chat as we go. I'll try to keep a good eye on it. In the event that I get disconnected, it could happen. Hopefully it doesn't. I'll work to get back on here pretty quickly. I am recording this webinar, so if you ever want to go back to anything that I've said, or if you have friends who missed it, please feel free to send them the link. I'll give it to y'all as soon as I'm done. And lastly, at the end of this webinar, please, if you could, fill out the survey. And that's if you're watching this live or if you're watching this later. Towards online on YouTube or anything like that. Your feedback is extremely important to me, and I'm making sure that graduate support services is where it needs to be and where it can be for the School of Nursing. All right, so today here is everything that we are going to go over. We're really going to look at just reading in general in terms of metacognition with reading strategies for graduate students. Another really important piece of this is just being able to think critically. I think I recognized pretty early on in my graduate program how time-consuming a reading can be and how just mesmerizing, especially when it piles up and you're like, what am I supposed to pull out of these chapters? So that's kind of the overarching theme for this. And so we're going to talk about ways to get organized while reading, adopting an active reading mindset, because a lot of times we just stare blankly at pages and you go, oh, what did I just read? We're going to look at active reading strategies. And then specifically, we're going to get into how to strategically read both textbooks and journal articles, because those are more of the common things that we'll see particularly in the curriculum. And then lastly, we're going to look at how to take notes while reading, because that's another important piece that sometimes we often can get really bogged down in regards to reading. So we're going to go ahead and jump right in. Let's talk about some things that you should be accomplishing before you even sit down to read. This preparation process is really important to make sure that you're getting the most out of the time. So you start with getting organized. One of the best things to do before you actually sit down is you need to figure out how much time it's going to take you to read something. So if you know it's a chapter that's like 50 or 60 pages long, are you going to sit down and try to accomplish it in one swoop, or are you going to take, 2 or 3 different times for sitting in order to get through those sorts of things? The next thing you want to do is find a place you can be uninterrupted. I know this sounds like something you've heard 100 times before, but it's really true. Find a place where you're not going to be bothered by your phone or your watch or your computer or anything like that, unless you're using it for note-taking. And make sure you're muting notifications. Make sure the people around you, for example, if you have a family, make sure you can find some time if it's really important information and things that you need to, read the first time and get it to stick. Make sure that you find that space that you can really just kind of pull through and be engaged with your reading. And lastly, of course, make sure you have all the materials you need before you get started. Something that I always like to do in my courses was I would lay out all the readings that I have for the week on a sheet of paper, and then I would schedule out about when I would read them. Another piece of that is like downloading articles off of Canvas sites, for example, because sometimes faculty can put them in different places. And so making sure you don't have to spend 20 minutes looking for a new article, wasting your valuable reading time where you've already told people, no, I'm not going to be, answering my phone or anything like that because I'm reading. The next piece of this is you need to set reading goals for yourself. To particular, how much and how often. So I think it's a really good habit, especially for those of you who are in our DNP and PhD programs, to actually be reading every single day. If it's not possible for you, I definitely understand taking days off, but the more that you build that habit, the better you're going to set yourself up for. And then how much, whether it's you're going to read in like hour-long chunks, which I recommend because you can spend 45 minutes to 50 minutes reading, take a 10-minute break, or if you're going to break it down into even smaller, larger chunks based on your commitments. You really need to set out that goal and that schedule for yourself. And then lastly, this is a really important piece. The more that you actively read, like I was talking about in our outcomes, the more time you save. So when you think about reading a textbook, a lot of times, you sit down, you sit there, you read a chapter, or you read a page or two, and you go back and you go, wow, I don't even remember a thing that we read. It's pretty common for a lot of people, but you're kind of wasting the time that you could be using for something else if you're not actively engaged in your reading. So one of the things you have to think about is how to actually be involved in the process. And like I say in the last bullet point, your goal is not to read everything. It's to understand it. I show you a little bit later on how to actually do these things, but to read every single word in a textbook or a journal article and be expected to remember it is not what your faculty members are asking you to do. They want you to be engaged with the material enough that you can, bring it back up in class, bring it back up in papers, and ultimately put it forth in your graduate studies and then your time beyond your schooling. So those are some things to think about before you even begin reading those textbooks or those journal articles. The next thing is actually, starting to think about opening that book or that article. I call it adopting a puzzle-solving mindset because that's kind of what you're doing when you open up a brand new article. It's something that you've never engaged in before. You're kind of putting all the different pieces together to get an understanding of the big picture. So I broke it down into 5 different steps. The first one is, if you're solving a puzzle, you want to look at the box to get the bigger picture. So you want to read the abstracts, the introductions, that first couple of sentences to really kind of get an understanding of, what's going on here. And then you need to sort your pieces out. So when you're doing a puzzle, then you kind of go, okay, I've got all my edge pieces over here and all my middle pieces over here. So that piece is reading the headers to understand what and where the big pictures are. So if you have a little flower off to the right side, or if you have a cute little puppy dog in the corner, you really want to spend some time reading the headers of the articles or the textbooks to understand, okay, what's being talked about here? What do I need to really pull out before I even dive into the text? The next piece is you're putting together the edges. So typically, what you want to do when you're reading is you need to be strategically reading sections based on that, building the bigger picture. So for articles, things that you're looking for right off the bat are you're looking for research questions, you're looking for theoretical frameworks, the discussion, the implications. That's kind of all you really need in journal articles. And for chapters, you usually have some sort of outline or some sort of key terms or something that's in the front of the chapter book that will give you your guide to reading. It's really important to kind of look through your textbook and don't ignore some of the little things that they may include in there, like, oh, visit this website for more information, or here's 15 or 20 practice questions that you can find at the back of the chapter. Those sorts of things are extremely important and can better help you check your understanding of it. Did you actually get the information from that chapter? The next part, you're filling in the bigger details. So these are those middle pieces that at the very beginning of the puzzle, you're like, I have no idea where this goes. Now you kind of are really understanding what's going on. So you're not only understanding what's in the chapter or what's in the journal article, you're connecting it back to what you've read in the coursework. And this connection a lot of people sometimes forget about, because this is where your faculty members will be like, okay, tell me what you read in a discussion board, and then apply it to your personal practice. So you need to think about things like, why would my faculty member make me read this, and how does it connect back to other topics? And then most importantly, the rest will fall into place. So we sometimes can get really bogged down over very minute details, and sometimes what we're really trying to focus on is just getting that big puzzle figured out, and then you kind of know, okay, well, this color matches up with this side of the picture, and then you eventually finish it. So this is adopting the puzzle-solving mindset of reading. We don't always think about it like this, but I figured this would give you kind of a good understanding of where you want to start. All right, so once you kind of understand that piece, then we really jump into the active reading portion of whatever you're looking into. So this is where you start really engaging the material in order to make sure that you have the best comprehension, and the most important thing, save your time so you don't have to reread what you already spent time reading. So active reading strategies, I'm giving you 4 of them. So the first part is just like I talked about in the last slide. You need to spend some time pre-reading, flipping through the pages, looking at that really big picture. I did an activity for the undergraduate nursing orientation where I gave them this paragraph that was really extensive. It talked about making sure that you don't overload something. If you have a lack of facilities, where do you go? You start sorting different things into piles, and eventually those piles end right back up where they are. And at the end of it, I told them that the process that they were talking about was laundry. Now, if you think back to a couple of sentences of what I just said, you're like, oh yeah, Lauren, that makes sense. But that overarching picture is going to help you better understand the details. Then you fill the rest in. The second piece of this is developing a note-taking method. I have a little bit more later that I'll talk about with what actually to do. But these are things like not over-highlighting and spending like, oh yeah, I need to know all of this, and then you have a whole text, a whole like paragraph or 2 highlighted, and you're like, well, I don't really know what I should have pulled out of that. You want to make sure that you're taking notes on the things that you need to be learning, not necessarily information that's new to you, and don't over-highlight or underline and figure that process out. Something else that you can do is read a section and then summarize. This is going to help you not reread and not let your mind wander. So start with a paragraph. This is a habit that you're going to have to probably build up to. So actively read a paragraph in 1 sentence on the side, or 1 sentence on a notebook or in a Word document or whatever you're using. Make a summary sentence of what you just read, and then read another section and then do it again. It takes a little bit more time, but you will not spend the time going back to try to reread 1, and 2, if you ever have to come back to that information, you already have those little bits and pieces and chunks together. Expanding on this one a little bit more, then what you can do is you can tie all your summary sentences back together, and that's basically a discussion board if you have to ask, if you get asked that, or a paper or something like that. So read a section, then summarize. A really quick strategy to know, 1, did I retain this information? 2, can I bring it back up in the future? And then, of course, you need to read to answer the following questions. Although I don't have a nursing background per se, graduate study is graduate study is graduate study. Like, we all I've taken research classes, theory classes. The frameworks are all the same. It's just with a different discipline. So some of the things that you can ask yourself is, how does this relate to the topic being discussed in the next class? So can you actually participate with the faculty member when they're bringing up certain pieces of information. That's something to really, it shows the faculty member that you're engaging and you're actually, building upon those discussion points that they sometimes build into their syllabi. You need to ask yourself, what are the objectives in the front of the chapter and article that it wants me to understand? So those are your guides. Use them. If you could answer those questions, move on. How much do I need to know for an exam? This is really important because obviously for your classes that are exam heavy, it can sometimes be very overwhelming. So use this. Map it over PowerPoints or class discussions to see what specifically needs to be read. Map it over any blueprints or study guides that your faculty members may give you. That's going to be a really key indicator of like the breadth and the depth that you need to know. And like I've said already, what are the resources that are available to me? Test questions, online resources. The easiest way for textbooks at least to know if you know the material is to find those test questions or those quiz questions and just simulate the test. That's why we have simulation to kind of walk you through the same processes that you've been going through. So if you simulate a test environment, you're actually practicing like you would play, you're going to have a better result at the end. So make sure you answer those following questions as you read, and you're more likely to remember the information that you're reading. All right, so now we're going to actually get really into the tangible parts of this webinar. I know I've been talking like very broad strokes overview, but I'm going to show you what you should actually look for and what that can look like in a textbook. So we're starting with textbooks. Of course, we're starting here with the front matter. A lot of this is rehashing what I've said at the beginning. So you've got these resources for help at the top. It says they have review question and answers from the Evolve website. There are case studies you can use if you're, for example, not someone who understands everything face value. I know I'm kind of person who likes to know why is this important to my overall study. So there's case studies. There's glossaries for definitions or pronunciations that you might need, animations if you like to see how certain things are in action. Then you have right here the overview of what you should be reading. So these are the key questions that you'll pull out from the chapter that you'd be reading. I pulled this out of an intro patho book. But you have these 5 questions. If you can answer these 5 questions, you really don't need to spend too much time beyond a little bit deep into those questions. Another hint I put out to the side is use these questions to build a study guide. So if you just pull these different questions, drop them in a document, and as you're studying for exams, for example, if you can answer this question without looking back at your notes or without looking back at the PowerPoints, then you probably have a pretty good understanding of it, and you're not going to spend so much time on the material that you've already got down. And then, of course, your chapter outlines. So you've got all of these different headers. Use these, ask yourself the 5 W's, and then from here, keep moving forward. So the next piece we have is looking through the abstracts and the introduction. So we've gone through the front matter of a textbook. Now let's jump into those first couple of paragraphs. In this specific chapter, there is about there's 4 different paragraphs that you could easily probably spend 5 minutes reading through. But what we learned before is that you really just want to skim through this really quickly to get your main idea. As you can see, I've kind of underlined some of these basic things. The bacteria, viruses, fungi, animal, insect-borne parasites. There's risk factors. There's a definition right here. Throw those definitions in the margin. But in reality, if you didn't notice already, this, 4 paragraphs of introduction, actually, they break it down right here in the outline. So you can essentially skip those 4 paragraphs because in these different pieces of the chapter outline, it talks about the pathogenic organisms. Or spends time looking at host characteristics and risk factors, the exact same things that I underlined on this. So if you get a good understanding from the outline, you don't have to read the introduction. If you want to read the introduction, you don't need the outline. You want to spend time picking and choosing what would be the best for your understanding, and keep moving. All right, and then picking and choosing what to read in a textbook. And admittedly, this can sometimes be very difficult, especially when you're going into the next level of your profession that has like boards exams, for example, and everything's really important. But here's my advice on what you would look for in a textbook. Of course, use your front matter. The next piece is use the headers of your textbook and turn them into questions. And then what you want to do is develop different levels of questions for the study guides that you're building. This is a little bit farther than just reading your textbook. This active reading and actively engaging with it, you're building study guides at the same time. So this is something you want to think about that may take a little bit more time on the front end, but you're saving yourself review time and study time on the back end. So when I'm talking about building different levels of questions for headers, this is really what I mean. So on the level 1, what are the 3 stages of general adaptation syndrome? So you're asking yourself what, and you're really looking just for knowledge, is do you know this information? Another level of heading or another level of questions you can ask yourself is this compare and contrast the resistance stage and the exhaustion stage. So this is basically asking, you're no longer the 5 W's, but it's asking the what's and the what's of these 2 different stages, and you're analyzing both of them together. The next piece is the level 3. So a patient is exhibiting X symptom. Which stage are they in and why? This is the evaluation, and this is at its root, this is what you're really going to be doing on your day-to-day clinical interactions and with your patients in the future. So being able to use those headers in order to break them down into questions and then filling in the rest. If you can answer the questions pretty good, you're going to be in good shape. The other piece that I would say about this, it's not necessarily in the next slide, but I would say use your PowerPoints that your faculty members have in order to kind of selectively guide your reading. I know not all faculty members post their PowerPoints at the very beginning or before class, but if you can get your hands on it, that's awesome. Using the syllabus as a guide, also super helpful. Textbooks are one of those things that it's really hard to pick and choose, but if you can do a couple of these basic steps, you're going to be in pretty good shape in order to really develop that understanding. I was talking a little bit about the levels of headers. I just wanted to briefly point out where that's coming from. So this is a very This is a topic that we talk a lot about in elementary school. Bloom's taxonomy of learning is where this is coming from. It's really easy and quick to Google, but these are the different stages of learning. So remembering all the way up to creating. And these are some of the words over here on the side that you can use to create those questions. Really, when we're talking about metacognitive learning strategies, this is like your basic, like, you're back in high school, what is the, what is this formula? Use it in this specific example. And then we kind of move up into your further and your deeper levels of understanding and knowledge. Think about this when you're going through that material, and that's going to better help you understand, like, where am I in this learning process, and what do I need to do to deepen that understanding? Another piece of this is looking at the charts to develop study tools as you go. So in addition to asking yourselves like the who, what, where's, the when, and the why, if you have charts like this is like a pre-made study tool for you, because what I would tell you to do is you would keep all of these top headers, and you would keep, maybe one column or 2 columns, and then you blank out the rest of these and see if you can recall that information that's missing, So it's a really easy way to create a study tool, as well as it's another way that information is presented that's not in the form of like a block paragraph. So if you ever read something and you're like, maybe a picture would be better, or maybe a chart would be better. This fungal infections chart does a really good job from that specific chapter that I pulled from to push that understanding better and to make it easier to memorize and eventually, obviously, regurgitate on an exam. So easy study tool that you can develop as you're moving through your reading, and you don't have to think about it going back again. You can just make it really quick in Excel, print it out, and then share it with your friends if you're interested in like having a group that is just constantly developing study tools and making your lives easier. All right. So the next piece we're going to do is moving into strategies for journal articles. This is really where a lot of my expertise lies, is in journal articles, just because I've spent a lot of time doing research as well as writing really in-depth analysis, and it really requires a lot of reviewing literature and things like that. So jumping right in the same way we did textbooks, when you're reading journal articles, they're all kind of really written the same way if you look at it. I'm very familiar with APA, so all the same information is present, especially if we're talking about journal articles that are peer-reviewed. So, for example, what I did was I pulled a journal article related to nursing and education. So this one's obviously assessing learning styles of graduate entry nursing students. So here's how you would read a journal article. You would start at this very front page, something that you'd immediately pull out of the catalog. And here are the questions that you're going to ask yourself, especially if you're doing a literature search. So you're looking up here at the top. Looking at the year. Is your article recent? This is 2017. This is about as recent as it gets, because typically journal articles take about a year to publish. So pretty recent. Next is your article from a reputable source. Have you seen it before? Is it peer-reviewed? Or is it something that, someone just randomly can submit to? Those are really important pieces, and you always really need to go for peer-reviewed, unless it's a really great article or journal that's not. But 9 times out of 10, they're all peer-reviewed. The next piece is who are your authors? I'd say 7 times out of 10, you don't know who your authors are. But if you have seminal pieces, or researchers who are very up to date in their field, you might actually recognize some of them. Another thing that you can do is if these are seminal pieces, you can connect it back to what else have they written about before. We all have our specialties, and so, for example, I'm in student success and retention, so there are certain theorists and certain bodies of literature that I'm just really comfortable with, and you eventually will be too. So it's important to look at your authors and see if you recognize anybody, or if it's something that you may have read before, or something else in class that you could tie it back to. Really important piece to look at. The next piece of this is the abstracts and the introductions. So you can really learn all about a journal article if you have a well-written abstract. I can't always promise you that an abstract will be well written, but I think the one for this journal did actually a pretty good job. You should be able to tell a lot of different information from a well-written abstract. So for example, in this one, I've already able to pull out my population, graduate entry nursing students in graduate entry nursing programs. I'm able to pull out the tool of measurement. So it's called the ILS. It tells you the quantitative tests that they ran. It tells you the results of using the tool to measure. It gives you a small discussion of those results. And then it even throws in something very important about reliability and validity, to make the reader go, okay, this isn't just a random test that was being done on this population. This is actually a reliable tool that has been validated across studies, and that is extremely useful and can be reputable, in not only furthering my understanding, but potentially spin-off studies and things like that. So I got all of that information simply from an abstract and introduction. And from here, there's really not too much more I need to read out of that journal article to have that full picture. So then we're jumping in the article right into the headers, just like we did for textbooks. And like I said before, most journal articles are written the same. So in reality, you just need to spend some time looking at them and then being strategic about what they're saying and how you can best go about reading it. So for example, the introduction, it's going to tell you why is this article important and what can it contribute. 9 times out of 10, you can skim/skip it up until about maybe the last couple of sentences where it might drop really what the problem is. The next piece you jump into is the background and the literature. A lot of times we can get really bogged down in the literature, especially if it's like spewing off facts in a particular area that we're not very comfortable with. Literature reviews get really easy to read once you get comfortable with them and once you actually know the background and the research area that it's in. So really the 2 questions that you need to be asking yourself is, don't get super bogged down in this study says and this study says and this is missing and this is missing. Ask yourself 2 questions and then move on. What's the problem and why hasn't it been solved? If you can answer those 2 questions by very simply skimming like a paragraph or 2, you're good to go. The next part of journal articles is the methodology. So this is really getting at the root of, okay, so we have this problem. What's the next piece? How are we going to measure this? How are we going to uncover the problem? Is this something new? For example, you're looking at your sample size. So are we running a qualitative study where it's only going to be a handful of interviews? Or are we running a quantitative study like this is when you're measuring 200 participants, for example, and you're using a measurement tool that's been validated? Those are really important questions to ask yourself, is to actually spend time looking at what they're measuring, how they're measuring it, are there good research questions that they're asking, and also are those research questions going to be answered by the way that they measured it, or is there another better way that they could ask them, or a different tool that they could use to get the answers that they're actually looking for. Then there's the data and results. These are things that what did our methods produce? So for example, you're going to have the demographics, you're going to have the learning style scores, the ILS properties. Those are all the different headers that were in this specific journal article. But when I'm looking at demographics, it's really important to understand my population, who is included, but who also isn't. For example, when we're talking about graduate nursing entry students, my first question is like, okay, well, you say graduate. Are these MSNs, are they DNPs, are they PhDs, are they postgrads? Like when I'm specifically looking at y'all's population as my graduate students, that's the first question I always ask, is what does that makeup look like? Because that can mean very different things if you're coming from bachelor's entry versus master's entry. So those are a couple of little distinctions that you always want to kind of like see if you can pick apart on who they're including and who they're not. Those are good things to think about. Then there was the learning style scores and the ILS properties. Those are things that I kind of skipped, honestly, when I was reading this, because of course, like I said, it really broke down a lot of the quantitative things that, one, I didn't necessarily understand, to be quite honest, because they were talking about like t-tests and things like that. When in reality, I just needed to jump down to the discussion and look at the scoring, and look if there was other things that needed to be pulled out. In the discussion, you're asking yourselves the questions, so what did they find and why is it important? This also can sometimes be where you want to spend a little bit more of your time out of all of these different sections, because it's really going to break down like why this study even had to happen, and what is it going to contribute to the body of literature, and how can it be repeated. It'll give you their limitations. And then the last piece is the conclusion. What else? What's next? The biggest thing that you need to ask yourself is, how is this important to me? How does this contribute back to the classes that I'm in? How does this contribute back to my overall, place of the profession? How does this relate back to my patients? I would spend most of my time towards these last two pieces, because it's going to give you the most information to pull back for an assignment or a paper or things like that. And it's really where the meat of the article is. So if you spend your time looking at those pieces, you're going to have a strong understanding of a journal article without necessarily spending so much time bogged down into the little details. All right. And here's basically what I said in a 5-point slide instead of a 7-point slide. So read the introduction and the conclusion to ensure you have an understanding of the breadth and depth of the article. Read the literature to a point. You want to spend time clarifying the background, the theoretical framework that are established. Understand the methods, the research question, the population. Find the results. Skip to the discussion to understand the results. And then lastly is something I didn't cover on the last slide, but I think it's really important, especially if you're having to come back to class to read it, is pull out the strengths and weaknesses of the article. So a lot of times we as graduate students, and I was guilty of this too, we get into this habit where I'm just like, feed me information, tell me every exact little thing I need to know. And then your faculty members are like, no, I want to hear from you. And you're like, oh, what do I have to, contribute? You always tell me to cite everything. I'm not an expert. But another piece you have to think about is what are the strengths and weaknesses of articles? Are there limitations that were or were not discussed? Something that could be done better? That deconstruction of this whole process really adds to your experience as a graduate student, and it makes you spend more time actively engaging in it when you think you actually have something to contribute back. So definitely think about the deconstruction of an article, and that's also going to help you figure out your discussion points for class. So pull out a quote or two that you agree or you don't agree with, or that's helpful, and then move on. All right, so the last piece of this is note-taking. This really is one of those things that's going to depend on your style. It's going to depend on how you're actually reading through your information, but in reality, here's a couple of things that I think would be worthwhile when you're talking about taking reading notes. So like I've said many times before, you're wasting your time if you have to reread, so your note-taking piece is fairly important. I wasn't the best at this when I went through graduate school, especially for my textbooks. I'd have to go back multiple times because a lot of the times I would just breeze through the chapter right before class and then, try to be done with it and then have to go back and read the material, actually. So then I'm going to break it down into two different types of note-taking. So taking notes on the physical document or chapter versus taking notes on lined paper or actual copy paper. So if you're taking notes on the physical document or chapter, I highly recommend it. It's helpful not only to remember, but that physicalness is actually, it shows that you have a better connection with the information because you're able to recall and you actually are strategically summarizing or writing or something like that. So when you're writing those things down, summarize those important paragraphs like I talked about. Highlight what's key to your understanding. Don't highlight the whole sentence. You need to look for keywords. You need to look for things that you should be learning, not necessarily information that's new to you. The next piece of that is underline examples that improve your understanding. So you've got your highlighting that means something. You've got your underlining that means something. And then the last piece of this is use sticky notes that mark areas that make you think beyond the textbook, Maybe use them in order to to refer back to if you have something that like really stuck out to you, if you have a section of the textbook that you need further clarification from. This is for that kind of like, that third level of like Bloom's taxonomy, moving those things back. So you don't have to specifically use this key for highlighting, underlining, and sticky notes, but you need to spend time figuring out like, okay, I'm going to use, I'm going to have this kind of key for code for highlighting and underlining and sticky notes. Figure out a strategy, stick to the strategy, change it up if you need to. The other pieces of this is if you're going to take notes on a separate document, which is what I typically did. I usually did both, but I had a hard time taking notes on separate documents. So what I recommend is using like an Excel document to take notes for journal articles, because it makes things a lot easier. I actually have a reading strategies like document that it's literally just like 4 rows and 5 columns, and at the very top of each column is one of these words. It's key findings, population, implications, limitations. And if I could answer and write a couple sentences in each of those boxes, I had a good understanding. That's all I needed. For textbooks, yes, you can take notes by outlining. It's very helpful for the headers. But also, you can make study guides instead of taking notes to kind of save yourself time. So if you think back to that chart that I had, rather than taking notes specifically about all of those things in the paragraph form, just make yourself a study guide, have your cheat sheet study guide that has all of those things filled in, and then your blank ones. And then you are taking notes, but you're doing it in a more strategic way that's saving you time on the back end when you're like having to go back and fill those in. And then, of course, you want to spend time writing down page numbers of important quotes that you can bring up again. Or if there's pieces of information where you're like, oh, I need to use this for my dissertation or my DMP project. You never want to think about something and go, oh, I don't remember where that even came up from. I think about that all the time for articles that I wish I could go back to, but I don't remember. So those are a couple of things that I would recommend for taking reading notes. I know it's not super, super specific, and I wish I had awesome examples. But do these sorts of things and then tie it back to pictures. If there are pictures that you can redraw in the book, or videos that you could potentially pop up that make understanding a little bit easier, all of those sorts of things are going to be immensely helpful as you're going through and trying to make sure that you have a place you can go back to this information. Because it's not really like a regurgitation anymore, it's a little bit deeper than that. And here are my final thoughts. We've kind of covered everything that I wanted to, throw out there today for reading strategies, but the biggest thing I would recommend is of course, you have to establish that habit for reading. I know it sometimes can be really overwhelming, especially when you have, full-time work and you have a family and you have a lot of other things competing for your attention, but set a schedule, set a same time every day. If not, figure out what works for you and commit to it. The other piece of that is, even if you have that schedule, if you are at information overload and you cannot retain any more information, it's better to just stop and give yourself a breather, take some time, get to the dishes that have been calling your name for the last hour or something like that. Reset and then come back. It's always going to make your time, that much more meaningful if you have that opportunity. Of course, figure out an organization and note-taking method that works for you. And then lastly, the more time you spend engaging with your reading, the less time you're going to spend relearning the information. So there's a difference between just learning the information, understanding the information, having enough, understanding to study, as well as regurgitate and synthesize. All of those levels of the learning process are very different from one another. So some of the stuff that I've talked about, you're like, Lauren, I don't have time for that. I barely have time for my other commitments that I have going on in my life. It's like, I understand, but some of these things, if you just spend a little extra something, if you change one, maybe 2 things in your reading, you don't have to commit to all of this, but you can change 2 things that establish that habit early. it's going to make a world of difference for you. So commit to 1 to 2 things from tonight that I've talked about, and then you'll be able to have a really great understanding, and reading will actually become more enjoyable for you. I highly recommend it. So here are my last couple of slides. I just dropped a link in the chat that is linked to a Qualtrics survey. I've got a couple more slides, so feel free to open this up and start filling out as I talk. But your feedback is extremely valuable to me. I read every single comment that's written down. I really appreciate if you would give me some feedback about this specific workshop, because 1, this is the first time I've ever put it together. 2, if there are things that you think I should add or things that you're doing that I should recommend. I love that kind of feedback, and it's going to be really helpful to me. The second piece of it is that we are writing a grant for graduate support, and there's a question in there that says, hey, you're a graduate student, what do you want to see? So if you could add any sorts of information in there, that'd be super helpful as we're meeting to develop our objectives and measurements and things like that. So definitely fill this out. It means the world to me, and I use it for reports and things like that. A few other things that are here. I put the UTESCO library resources. Most importantly, wanted to point out Miss Emmy Lopez. So Emmy is your librarian for the School of Nursing. Wonderful resource. I'm sure all of you have been introduced to her already, but use her for all of your research needs. The next piece is actually what I do, a little bit farther broken down. So in the general column, I do academic skill coaching if you want to talk about test taking strategies, reading strategies, obviously what we're doing here today. Other things in the general category that I can help you with are public speaking. If you have like a group presentation that you want some feedback on, I can do what I can in those specific categories. Another piece of that is scholarship review. So if you're applying for scholarships and you maybe didn't get one in this last round, we can look at your scholarship and know, and we'll give you feedback in terms of, oh, you may want to expand on your leadership experience. Or spend time actually making this a complete sentence, those sorts of things we can help you with. The middle column is our career readiness, especially for my MSNs as we prepare y'all for your clinicals. I do resume reviews if you ever want to drop me your resume and then meet with me after I've kind of written up a little bit of feedback. Very, very happy to do that. And the earlier the better. Also do cover letter review. So if you have cover letters that you're actually using for applications, happy to do that. And the last piece is mock interviews, and so it never hurts for that little extra bit of practice. So we can take care of that as well. And then on the right side, I'm going to have in-person and online workshops. So that's what this is. We're doing 4 different webinars this semester. And I'm covering a variety of different topics. So like I said, if there's something that you don't see and you think I should do, drop it in the comments of that Qualtrics survey. And then if you want to do peer review or work session opportunities, where maybe you meet with me for like 20-30 minutes and we go over a piece of writing, you spend 20 or 30 minutes editing, and then you come back to me and show me your next draft, more than happy to do that as well. And specifically for graduate students, because I know your time is very limited, I offer in-person appointments in the School of Nursing. We can do phone appointments, or we can do appointments here in this Canvas conference. Whatever works the best for you within business hours, I am more than happy to accommodate, and that includes the lunch hour. I can move my lunch hour around if absolutely needed. So here's the rest of the workshops for the semester. So APA style in Wednesday, developing a scholarly argument in March, and then citations, references, and paraphrasing, acknowledging the work of others in April. If you RSVP, I'll send you the link exactly like I did this past time, or I'll just share it with everybody like I did every day before. So please RSVP so I know if you're coming. And then the last thing is getting in contact with me. Again, I dropped my contact information for phone, email, office number. Also, A couple of things to point out. So you do have access to Starfish through Canvas. If you pull up any of your pages and you look on the navigation panel on the left, you'll see this link called Starfish. You can log into there and you can drop yourself on my calendar at any time, day or night. So feel free to schedule yourself on my calendar rather than emailing me and asking, coordinating schedules back and forth. You can see my schedule for basically a year out if you really wanted to. So go ahead and drop yourself on my calendar if you need me. Send me documents ahead of time, so writing samples, resumes, things like that. If you didn't provide it or you don't email it, I'll typically email you and ask for it so that I can best prepare for your appointment. The other piece of this is so this Canvas course that you logged into called Sun Student Support Services, this is the home of all of the different programs and handouts and things that I'm building out for graduate students. So if you check back from time to time, some of those modules are starting to be built out. For example, the resume and the interview one, I just finished building out. So stay tuned for more things. And if there are handouts that you think I can pop on there, feel free to recommend them. I really just want to be able to provide these sorts of links and resources for y'all so you can get the information at your fingertips, because that's the most important thing to me. So if you have any questions, drop them in the chat. There's a question that says, will you be posting your slides to Canvas for future reference? Absolutely. There will be a page that I will build out with the slides as well as a link to this webinar. I'm going to put it up on YouTube so that you can come back and access this information. So if you don't have any more questions, that's all I have for y'all. Let me know if you need anything. Happy to help. Have a good evening.